This is Pinnacle Lutheran Church Sunday Bible Study. The following session was recorded on Sunday, April 28th, 2013, continuing the book of Revelation.
So, we're going to get out of... no, we're going to be in Revelation for a while. We're going to get out of Revelation 11 today, and we're going to actually get into Revelation chapter 12. But just so that we've got a good footing as to which direction we're going, I just wanted to read again verses 15 through the end of the chapter. So maybe if we go to the back. Bruce, Mr. Hyde, do you have that?
Yep.
Okay.
Then the seventh angel blew his trumpet, and there were loud voices in heaven saying, "The kingdom of the world will become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever." And the 24 elders who sit on their thrones before God fell on their faces and worshiped God, saying, "We give thanks to you, Lord God Almighty, who is and who was, for you have taken your great power and begun to reign. The nations raged, but your wrath came, and the time for the dead to be judged, and for rewarding your servants, the prophets and saints, and those who fear your name, both small and great, and for destroying the destroyers of the earth." Then God's temple in heaven was opened, and the ark of his covenant was seen within his temple. There were flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, and earthquake, and heavy hail.
Okay. And now we're going to get into chapter 12. Any remaining questions on Revelation 11? Jeff?
When was the ark last seen in the Old Testament?
Say that one more time.
When was the ark last seen in the Old Testament?
I don't know offhand.
Before Zedekiah.
Let's see. I don't know right offhand, Jeff. Why do you wonder?
I just was curious when it was lost from the Israelites, and now apparently it's in heaven. But I just wondered if there was a specific battle or event that took place where it was lost from them.
No, and certainly there was. Which one it was is not coming to mind right now.
Okay, yeah,
So,
just curious.
yeah, but it's so you're starting to see here. Let's see, where is it referred to here?
Last verse.
495 in your Bible.
I'm sorry.
Do you have the Lutheran Study Bible?
Yeah,
There's a chart on 495.
on page 495.
Yes.
Oh, really? With regard to the Ark of the Covenant.
The right half of the chart is Ark of the Covenant.
Okay.
Are you in the Red Bible too?
She's in the Lutheran Study Bible.
Oh, I'm going to read it later.
We need to get, all right.
Is around
Oh, man.
So 597 BC with Nebuchadnezzar, which is listed in 2 Chronicles, around 597 BC. Because the ark would be located. You look there in 640 circa around 640 BC. The ark was relocated at the temple by Josiah, as we see in 2 Chronicles 35:3. Is everybody that has the Lutheran Study Bible, can you see that? The part where it's talking about right here, 600 BC or 640 BC. And so somewhere then, I guess it appears between 640 and 597 BC, the Ark of the Covenant and its specific location becomes a little bit sketchy.
Okay.
That's not saying, but when Babylon took the people, there was no mention of the ark going with them.
Yeah.
But the thing is, they would have had to have something up until Jerusalem was destroyed, because otherwise they couldn't have done the ritual.
Right. And
Whether the original one was still there is speculated.
Right.
Or they had a duplicate or something.
Right, but the locatedness, and you bring up a good point, and I think, Jeff, what you were talking about, and what the book of Revelation is talking about, what's huge, not just for the Jews, but for us, even still to this day, is the locatedness of God. They needed to know where he could be located and found. And how, that's a very common question that still is very much argued within Christendom today, is, you know, this is exactly what is or the point when you start to say Christ is located in, with, and under the bread and wine.
But that's what I was wondering too, in this passage it says, then God's temple in heaven was open. Oh, okay, right there it says in heaven.
Right.
So that's where the ark is, this is in heaven.
Right, but you started to look at it too, is that there were some changes too that happens after Jesus' resurrection. There's going to, and we're going to see this today in Revelation 12. There's significant battles that are going to be happening, monumental battles that are really, I'm trying to think of how the best way to explain it is, because you get into Revelation chapter 12 and all of a sudden you start to see the influence that the demons, the angels, and Satan have had throughout history, the presence that they actually have in heaven, in the courts of God. And we're going to see that today. And there's going to be a great battle in heaven, and I believe it starts at about 12:5, maybe a little bit later, where Satan is actually in heaven with God after he's been cast down from the earth, or after he'd been cast down onto the earth. In other words, after the creation, Satan was back in heaven, and he was travailing and traversing all over the place, and he was doing things there.
But is that surprising? I mean, in Job, it shows that Satan was with him in heaven.
Right. It's not necessarily surprising that he's coming and going wherever he wishes and however he pleases. What is surprising is what ends up it maybe is a little bit more surprising is we don't understand necessarily what he was there doing. Satan was there in front of God, accusing us rightly of the things that we were doing, calling us sinners and saying that there was no recourse and there was no way to save us. That's what Satan was doing. And there's going to be something that happens, significantly changes all of that on the day of ascension.
He never read the story of Jesus?
Well, see, but that's the thing, is that Satan's in heaven. What he's trying to do, Luther, amongst others, used to say that Satan was the great lawyer. No, that's not. Now, if you've ever,
As opposed to the other way around.
right? But what he's doing, what Satan's doing, is trying to make the case, which he really doesn't have to make the case at all to God. He's going to him and saying, "These filthy, dirty, rotten, no good scoundrels. They don't deserve your grace. They don't deserve your mercy. Look at them. And then this whole idea of, you are God, you can do these things. You are, he's accusing us before. But then what's going to happen as we get into 12, we've got to weed through some stuff before we get there. What happens once the ascension happens is Jesus comes and he rightly takes his throne. And from then, Satan never, ever is able to be in front of God again. In other words, he will never be able to accuse us before God. In other words, we don't have an accuser anymore. He's been thrown from heaven. He doesn't stand before God as an advocate. He's no advocate at all. Who stands now as our advocate? Jesus. That's the significance of the ascension. And that's we'll actually get to that as we go on. But there's chapter 12 is just it's awesome. Just in terms of the things that it explains that are applicable to us today. Because what's being talked about, and I'm sure you've seen already in the book of Revelation, rather than looking at it and saying that these things apply to specific times, it's better to understand that these things apply to the whole of Christendom, the whole of creation. And so we're going to see this, now when we get into the woman with the child and the dragon in Revelation chapter 12, where we're really going to start to see the timelessness of these of what's going on. So I'm going to make sure that we're going as slow as we can. We're going to kind of go verse by verse here. Revelation chapter 12. Let's read verses 1 and 2. Ed, would you mind?
And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains and in the agony of giving birth.
Okay, that'll be good. Okay, so we've got to really regroup and remember where it is that we've been. Okay, in order for these next things to start to make sense, we've talked a lot about what it is that the church is going to be responsible for within the world. We've just gotten out of hearing how the church is going to be persecuted, etc., so on. Now, we're almost taking a step back again. And we're starting to talk about a woman with a child. Now, there's going to be a lot wrapped up into this particular description. But it's important to look at some of the qualities that she has. Okay? A great sign appeared in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. Okay? Just that first line is packed with so much of what we've already gone through. So let's review kind of what some of those things mean. Okay? Is she radiant? Is she radiant? She's clothed, exactly. Very important use of the word there. She's clothed with radiance. Someone has clothed her, and what ends up happening is the brightness that she has is a reflection. Okay? She, in and of herself, has no brightness in her, but she reflects the brightness that she has been clothed with. Okay? Under her feet is the moon. What does this tell us about her? It's okay to use words in the church that you wouldn't necessarily use in outside of the church. Okay? It's okay to use. Oops.
Like she's on a pedestal?
Yep. Subjection. Yeah. She has been put up to a place higher. It's okay to talk about that sort of stuff in the church. In the world, we don't like to talk about that sort of stuff. But the moon has been put, in other words, the lesser of the lights, has been put in subjection under her. She reflects the light of what? The sun, or the greater of the lights. Okay? So, on her head she wore a crown of stars. Oh wait, actually I think it gives a number, doesn't it? Okay? Crown. What are crowns significant of? Remember we talked about this? Who wears crowns?
Nobility.
What's that?
Nobility.
Nobility. Most especially, think about it in terms of like the Olympics. Okay, we would give medals. Back in the olden days, they gave crowns or wreaths. Okay, that's what she's wearing. In other words, a victory has been won. She is victorious. Okay? And it has 12 jewels in it. Now this is where it starts to get a little bit tricky, but we have to remember the 3.5 we've been talking about. You remember the 3.5? Okay? So the 3.5 of the Old Testament and the 3.5 of the New Testament. Bear with me here just for a second. Okay? Now, and remember that all these things, there we go, I should have put that a little bit higher. There we go. So the 3.5 before the cross, the 3.5 after the cross, and then this culminates obviously in the last day. And then this, of course, over here on the other side is creation. Okay? All right, etc., so on. So what's happening is, this is where where we start to get into types. Okay, remember how we had the conversation before we started in our study on the book of Revelation as to the importance of noticing the differences between the types. Okay? The 12 used here is a type. Okay, it's to say the 12 jewels that are in her crown signify something.
Not the 12 churches?
Okay, 12 churches, but most specifically it goes back to and it says there were how many tribes of Judah? 12, okay, in the Old Testament. So the 12 jewels are signify or are types of the 12 tribes of Judah. So the 12 tribes. And then also, we go into the New Testament, the 12, what's a significant 12 that's used in the New Testament? Disciples. Okay, so the disciples. Now here's the interesting thing. We're talking about not just any ordinary woman, she's the mother of something. Okay, when we start to think of mothers with regard to the Christian church, who's the first one you think of? Mary. Okay, now we're not going to stay focused on her too much. We're not Roman Catholics, but she is important. Okay, so Mary is one of the mothers, is one of the types of mothers that is, she's going to be a type of something. She's going to be showing us something. Okay, she's going to give birth to something. Okay, so too, the 12 tribes gave birth to, and or from the 12 tribes came who? Okay, Christ. He was the leader of those particular tribes. So while these tribes in faith believed the things that had been written about the Messiah, the promises that had been given, which then gave birth, literally, by ancestry and genealogy, etc., so on, to Christ, which then gave the foundation of what? The Christian church. So in other words, their faith that these things were going to happen, the faith in Jesus looking forward, was going to give birth, this is the important language that's going to be used in chapter 12, gave birth to Christ. So too, the disciples gave birth. To who? And to what? The church. To the church. So they're carrying on the very same thing that's going on. And this is why I'm saying here too is, why it's important to remember, it's not talking about any specific woman. We're talking in types. So as to say, in the Old Testament, there was a type of a mother, namely the 12 tribes. In the New Testament, there was a type of a mother, namely the 12 disciples. Okay? But then you start to work in different finer ways too. I see some quizzical faces right now. I want to stop. Questions?
Could she be seen to represent Israel?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Right. Yep. Other questions? And maybe as we go further, the quizzical looks will turn into smiles. I hope so. Okay? So we see here what's happening is it's not just talking about one specific person that's ever existed. Okay? We need to get out of that understanding and really start to understand. And this will make more sense, I promise. What we're talking about here is the great birth of something. And the fact that there's somebody who's tried to kill her and her offspring for specific purposes. Okay? There's a lot in the first six verses of Revelation chapter 12. And maybe we read just to put it into context what's going on. So let's pick up again at verse 3 and we'll go through verse 6. Mr. Walsh.
And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns on his heads, 7 diadems. His tail swept down 1/3 of the stars of heaven and cast them down to earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. She gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was caught up to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days.
All right. So, there's that number again. 1,260. Equivalent to the 42 months. Equivalent to the 3.5 years. Now remember, it's not a real 3.5 years. It's not a real 1,260 days. It's not a real 42 months. This is, when we see the 3.5, we have to understand that what it's talking about is the entire time between the ascension and the last day. In other words, this is one half of the perfect number 7, creation. Here's one half, here's the other half. So when the 3.5, when it's talked about here, it's not just talking about Mary, who was the mother of the church. In other words, giving birth to Jesus, who the faith of the church was founded in. But also you look at it and say the church and or all those of faith in the Old Testament were a type of Mary as well. In other words, by virtue of their faith that had been taught to them, they gave birth to the church as well. Is it starting to make a little bit more sense? Now, just for fun, not necessarily for fun, that's not the way I should be teaching this. Now, because it's not fun, what ends up happening here is we look at it and say, all right, let's think about it in terms of the New Testament, or really the time of Christ's life. Okay, from the time that he was born until the time that he died and rose again. Okay, now where is the dragon? Where's the locatedness of the dragon? In heaven. Okay. Now, and this goes back to what's his color? What's the significance of red? Blood. Okay. In other words, another way that it can be understood is red is also is synonymous color with deception and the lies. So if your favorite color is red, I'm joking. I'm joking. I'm just saying that because mine's blue. Okay. But anyway, so you look at it and say,
Wait a minute. Is it red signifies deception?
Deception, lies, blood, murder.
Interesting. Because in the secular world, red is a power color. You'll see men in powerful positions with red ties on.
Mm-hmm.
You'll see an awful lot of red on women who are in powerful positions.
Cardinals?
Red shoes.
Now, you're meaning the birds, not the guys that's...
I'm sorry.
Wear red shoes.
Yeah, that's right, the red shoes. I mean, that's interesting.
We got to be careful though. We're not get too crazy. But the point is, and this goes back to, and remember when we had the conversation about the fact of, okay, remember when the horsemen were coming? Okay, there was a likeness. Okay, there was one of the horsemen that was coming dressed in whiteness. It was like something. In other words, he was coming, and by virtue of the fact, it's almost like, back to the horsemen, it's like when I was a little kid and I used to put a fireman's suit on me. And I thought I was a fireman, and I tried to make everybody else convinced that I was a fireman. So to the horseman, his job was to make everybody believe that, the horseman is evil. Back when we were talking about the horseman. But his job was to convince people of something that was opposite of what the truth was. So too, what's happening here is we're seeing this dragon, which is who? Take a wild guess. Right. Okay. Satan. Dana Carvey.
Well, just since you brought it up, the second horse is red.
And the second horse.
The second horse symbolizes destruction and violence.
Right. So you see it, and it's right. So you're seeing it, there, but going back to, once again, the types, that are happening, there's a lot of deception going on. A ton.
We also look at a meaning like the word red, the different meanings come from different areas of the world and different thoughts and like that. So one place it can mean power, another place it can mean, different destruction.
Right. Right. Deception. Right, and so that's why I say just be careful not to take it necessarily too far now, because within the context of the biblical writings, yes, red meant something entirely different. It didn't mean that people that wore red were necessarily evil. It just meant that when you start to talk about it in terms of colors, certain colors mean certain things, certain numbers mean certain things, and they're consistent. They're consistent throughout, okay? So what's going on in heaven is that, okay, he has 7 heads. 7. Perfection. He appears to have 7. Okay, when you see his 7 heads, you start to look at it and say, okay, 10 horns, that's another perfect number. But he's there with deception. He's not there for any other purpose than to deceive. On his heads were 7 diadems, another perfect number. But he's playing games, and his sole job here is to be of destruction and to bring about death and accusations and murder. Okay? His tail swept down 1/3 of the stars of heaven. Now we've seen that reference before. The stars of heaven were referred to as what? Remember this earlier? Angels. So 1/3 of the angels of heaven were swept down from heaven, down onto earth. So what's happening is the red dragon was in heaven doing these particular things. He swept down with him 1/3 of the angels with him. Now, that's not all of the angels, but that's quite a few. Where did this happen? And when did this particular thing happen? The fall. This is what we're talking about, the fall right now. Okay? So, and the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth. Now, here's the thing, you guys. Right now, it's like a big, huge beach ball on a tee, and I'm trying really hard not to whack it as hard as I can because I want to go as slowly as we can. What is the first mother that the dragon or the serpent stood before? Eve. The mother of what?
Civilization.
All people. All creation. Eve was a type of Mary. She was going to give birth to creation. But what stood in her way is this fallen dragon with the 1/3 of the angels who had fallen from heaven. And his job was not to tell her the truth, but his job was specifically deception. To cause her to fall into death. Okay? And as this goes on, and this is the Old Testament, this is happening right back here in the first 3.5. These things are happening. And even though these things are happening, God is still going to enact these things perfectly. Everything's under control. Okay? But then we go further, a little bit further. Yeah?
So this isn't really chronological then? Or it says,
Oh, it's...
in verse 2 it says she was pregnant, was crying out in birth. And you have a great sign, but then it says, and another sign appeared. And then it says his tail swept down 1/3. So, because then his tail swept down 1/3 would have happened before the fall.
Right.
But
right.
2.
But we're looking at in terms of setting up the chronology of it. You're looking at it and saying one of the things that that the book of Revelation does is it wraps everything from the Bible all into one book. So in terms of the chronology, you're looking at it and saying, okay, yes, it's very difficult, I guess, to try to set it up in a very neat and orderly way. And that's one of the things specifically as I've studied this, I've thought, cow, I mean, you can't put one thing before the other, and it really seems to not make sense. But then all of a sudden, when you start to realize that you're not necessarily dealing in literals, but you're dealing in types, and you're dealing in figures, and you're dealing in representations, and you're dealing in numbers, and you're dealing in symbols, and you're dealing in colors. You're dealing in all sorts of these things. You're not talking about the abstract. What's being talked about is that all these different things, which ties everything together. And you have to know what each one of these particular things means, because then when you look at it and say, okay, when it's talking about a mother, now remember from the very beginning, remember when we started reading about the letters to the 7 churches? These weren't just literal letters to the church in Philadelphia, the church in Laodicea, they were letters to all churches throughout all time, throughout all places, for us even now to look at and to understand what they're meaning. And that's been consistent throughout Revelation. So when we get to this particular point and say, okay, well, which woman is he talking about? Well, we have to start looking at it and saying, okay, when we look at it most specifically, ultimately what we're going to get to is this. We're going to ultimately get to that in terms of Mary being the perfect type of a mother. Okay? Why is she the perfect type of mother? Because who did she give birth to? To Jesus. Okay? Mary's not perfect, but she is the perfect type of mother. Okay, Eve was a perfect type of a mother as well because she gave birth to creation. Okay? Now, and it gets even more complicated because you start to look at it and say, well, these 12 tribes were mothers as well. What? They're men. Types. Types. That's what we have to remember, is that you start to look at it and say, with regard to trying to figure out and ascribe genders and ascribe any sort of human common sense to all of this, you can't. Good luck. Go ahead, David.
Just a thought that popped in my head. Perhaps God's giving us a glimpse of the way He looks at things.
Yeah, right.
Because He doesn't see things in linear fashion.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't see things, I mean, in a nice order, yeah, but He looks at it and sees it all at once, in all its dimensions, all at the same time, and He comprehends it.
Yep.
We don't think that way. We're very, especially since the last few centuries, we're all very linear people.
Right.
So He's just saying, this is the way I look at it.
Yeah, and it's...
I wondered if they were
Just a
cast prior to the fall.
Well, think about it like this. I mean, you see, like, cast or caught up. I mean, yes, in terms of Genesis, absolutely, they're cast down. They're cast down, but understanding being cast away from something, we often look at it and say, I'm casting it off like that, But the reality is that literally, it basically means to be cut off, to be cast off, to be cast away. Just basically means to be separated. And really you start to get, we not only are we linear, but we're very specific with regard to our language. We're very, how do you want to say? It's not that we lack definitions. It's that our definitions are way too literal a lot of times. And that's good in certain instances.
Okay, I wondered if that meant cast off or if that meant no longer able to accuse.
Yeah, no, cast off would be, they're cast off into the particular, the time that they will not be able to accuse is going to come up here in just in a few moments, but that doesn't mean that they will cease to accuse. And that's what's going to happen, is that you then are dealing in two different realms, because in the high courts of God, in God's high courts, these accusers, they won't even be admitted anymore. The doors will be barred to them. But who will continue to have to believe? Who will continue to be tormented by the accusations? Us. That is what we constantly are finding that we fight with. The accuser is still alive. And he tries to, on the temporal plane, to make... He's telling the truth. And the way that it sounds a lot of times to me is, and I'll just use an example, is, you're not worthy to be the pastor of that church. Think of all the things that you've done when you were younger. And by the way, you're speeding on the way to church. And not only that, but you're looking at somebody else's cars, and all of a sudden you're like, where's this coming from? And you realize that, yeah, although the accuser has no right and no place in the court of God, my advocate, Jesus, is your advocate. But the accuser exists on the temporal plane. And so you see in biblical history different times and different types of casting off. So in the first one, you look at it and say, okay, Satan and his demons are cast from heaven. And then they come and they go and these particular things. And then, now, there's the promise that's been given. God gives the promise to Eve in the Garden of Eden, right? Is it done? Be careful how you answer. When God says, you are saved and here's how you shall be saved, are we saved? Uh-huh. We do not.
Be saved through childbirth, right?
What's that? No.
I'm on a different wavelength.
You're on a totally different wavelength.
Okay.
When God says it, it's done. We don't see it enacted, but it goes back to what David said. That's one of the qualities of being eternal. God is not bound by time. We think in these ways because we're bound by time. It's 9:36. God doesn't care. What is time to Him? He's eternal. He's never known the bounds of time. That's who we're dealing with. So then when we start to talk about these things in terms of a linear chronological structure, okay, we have to then go back to it and what that oftentimes stands in the way of us being able to understand is that when God said, Jesus is going to be sent for you, or the son of you, Eve, is going to bring about the salvation of mankind, in the mind of God and in the plan of God, it's already done. He sees everything. He knows how it's all going to play out. He knows every single bit of the plan. He knows where this is going to be, how it's going to be done, who's going to do what, and all these, everything. So it's completed. And that's one of the, but then you go back to it, now you bring it into another particular realm, okay? And this is what the sermon's about this today, is we look at it and say, okay, Jesus says to his disciples, in a little while you will not see me, but after a little while you will see me. And that just drives the disciples nuts. Like, what do you mean? Well, okay, now we start to think about what it is that Isaiah reminds us of. A day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is to a day. And we start to realize that, okay, the way that we need to stop reading the Bible according to our understanding of these things and realize that God has written these things with simple language to give us insights as to who He is, what He thinks, and how He's doing these things for us. Because when you continue to read the Bible according to what we want it to say, well, you can make it say all sorts of different things. I mean, good grief. You know, there were times where Christians made the Bible say, well, we can go out and kill non-Christians. We can make them become Christians by using our swords and lopping their heads off. It doesn't work that way. God has always said that the greatest church growth has always come from just one simple mean: the proclamation of His Word. But our own history a lot of times starts to convince us that there needs to be more. Why? Do we not trust? And the answer is no, we don't.
There must be something I can do.
And it's hard. Because you look at it and it was very... just a real quick aside here. I had asked some of the 8th grade catechism class, all of them actually, to write an essay about the 6 chief parts of the catechism. And there was one that I read, it was awesome. It was a really, really good one. But there were 2 other ones that I read that I thought, wow, is this how they really see Lutheranism? And some of the things that they said was, God wants us to know that we're really bad people. I'm like, huh? Wow, that's awful. And the 10 Commandments are there to show us that we've really been rotten. I'm like, okay. They're there because you start to look at these things and you say, our conceptions of these particular, how we see things, or what we hear, a lot of times is not what's being said. We saw this in last week's gospel lesson. If you are the Messiah, tell us. And Jesus says, I have told you. You just haven't been listening. I've told you 5 or 6 times already in John's Gospel. Or you get to, like I said, I don't mean to necessarily go into that aside, but you start to look at it and say, the way that I was reading those is I thought, wow, I mean, as a pastor, I'm trained to be able to tell the differences between Methodists and Baptists, Presbyterians, etc. And when I was reading these particular things, I couldn't help but believe that for 2 of these kids, it seemed to me like they were coming out of a Baptist church, experiencing Lutheranism for the first time, and not really understanding how to deal with grace. It was awful. Because there really isn't a lot of grace in the Baptist church. There's a lot of waving of floppy Bibles and do this in the name of Jesus. There's very little grace in those churches. And it's sad. It's really, 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 really sad. And, for you, I mean, you're not necessarily, you're not trained to understand the differences. There are huge differences. And to understand historically that there are entire denominations of Christendom that do not believe in salvation by grace through faith. It's unbelievable. And I saw that written in 2 essays.
Yeah, I wonder where they got it from. They're not getting it from the teaching here.
I've never taught that.
Maybe somebody else should be in the class with them, like the parents.
But it's and like I said, there were others that were right spot on, knocked it out of the park. I love it because I hear all the time, 7th graders can't articulate our faith. No, they articulate it better than adults do. They really, really do. Because they don't overthink it. And it's one of those things where we go back to when we were looking here in Revelation chapter 12. We're sort of asked as Christians, we're not sort of asked, we're really asked as Christians. And it's assumed that you already know all this stuff. You already know about the banishment of Satan from heaven. You already know about the fall of Satan and the temptation of Eve. You already know exactly what's happened with regard to these things. You know about what happened with regard to the pain that's come in terms of childbirth and childbearing. But the thing about it is that a lot of times we only focus on the pain and we forget what it is exactly, going back to what it is that John talks about in Revelation and or Jesus talks about in John chapter 16, where he says, yeah, you all remember pain. But it's only when you have the baby where you forget it all. And that's all it's ever been about. The baby. That's all it's ever been about. But we forget all the time. And I hate to use such loaded or pregnant language. Y'all are pregnant with Jesus. Why? Because He puts Himself into you. How? Through baptism, the Lord's Supper, and the Word of God. You're so pregnant you don't even know you're pregnant yet. Sorry. But just to be consistent with the language, is that He's so in you and part of you that you... look at it like this. It's like, I love buffets, And it's almost like, have you ever gone... I shouldn't ask you this. I'll confess to you. There are times where I've had too much food, and yet I still think I need to have more, and I somehow try to fit it into me more like this is more like a hollow arm or something like that. Okay, here's the thing. You've been so filled with Jesus, there is no other place to put more of Him. But yet we continue to insist that we've got to stuff our face with Jesus. He's here, giving Himself so abundantly to you that you look at it and you say, well, it couldn't be as simple as just hearing the Word of God. That's what the Bible says. That's really how simple it is. And a lot of times, whether it's us thinking, well, certainly, great God who would create the world, He would work in more elaborate. No, He really doesn't work in very elaborate ways at all. And not only that, but it goes back to what we had said. He's told us how everything's going to be. No surprises. No baiting and switching. How it's going to be. And he not only that, but He lets us know all these particular things that he's saying here. So, I'll wrap up with this. I'm going to wrap up with this, and then I'm going to we're going to go into verse 7 next week. She gave birth to a male child. We know that, Eve gave birth to a male child. Mary gave birth to a male child. And what's happening here is Satan's job. The number one thing that he's trying to do is to kill who? The woman? The baby. Okay? She's trying. The devil, the dragon, is trying to kill the baby. But he's taken away. Now let's think about all the different... once again, He's not just taken away once. Think about it in terms of right after Jesus was born. Who wanted to kill him?
Herod.
Herod wanted him dead. So then he and Mary and Joseph went to Egypt and hid. But not only that, but we think about it in terms of, okay, you think about it in terms of going back even further. What happened with Moses? All these types of Christ follow the same pattern. Moses was what? Was his birth proclaimed to people? Was he shown off to the community? He was hid so that he wouldn't be killed. And these types of things that happen, like I said, the patterns that they follow, it's repeat, 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 repeat. Why? Because I forget. I don't know about you. I forget. And so I need to know these patterns to remember, oh, yeah, he's doing it the same way that he's always done it. From the beginning, now until the end. Okay? So it goes on. Here is, he's going to rule the nations with a rod of iron, but her child would be caught up to God in his throne. Okay, when did that happen? And just think about it in terms of a number of different occasions. Satan's job was to try to, where did Satan try to derail Jesus? Think about Matthew or Luke 4 most especially. The desert, when he tried to do what? Tempt him. Okay? You see it being manifested in all sorts of different ways. Satan's not trying to overtly go up to him and stab him in the heart or anything like that. He's trying to derail him from what? Or to dissuade him or convince him that what is not necessary? The cross. That's how Satan is looking to kill. Because if Christ doesn't go to the cross, are we forgiven of our sin? Will he rise from the dead, therefore giving us the promise of a resurrection? Satan would win completely. Okay? So, and not only that, but then he would be caught up to God in his throne on the ascension. We'll talk about that more next week. And the woman fled into the wilderness. Once again, we see Eve is banished to the wilderness. Mary goes off to Egypt, etc., so on. But then also, what ends up happening is that we start to see that Mary, and I should have said this the other way. We're not looking at Mary being the perfect mother. I'm totally misspoken. I apologize. What we start to understand is this. The church is the mother. And every gift that has ever been given, of every gift that God has ever given in creation, this is his crown jewel. She is his crown jewel. That is the best part of creation. It's been given for us. Not only that, but as Christians especially, to be able to treat the church like the bride that she is. I'm guilty of not treating her like the bride that she is. A lot. Okay? But see, we'll see here, where she has a place prepared by God in which she will be nourished for 1,260 days. Once again, what's going to happen here is that the ultimate mother, the church, is going to be banished into the wilderness for that 1,260 days, which is synonymous with this, which spans the time between the ascension and the last day. And the promise is that she's going to be taken care of. She will be assaulted, but she will be taken care of. And not only that, but the baby, remember, it's all about the baby. The baby has not been triumphed. Can't. Has trumped or the baby has been triumphant. Satan has not triumphed over the baby. Yeah. And every attempt he's failed. So then what's left is Satan then looks to try to destroy the mother. That's what's left. And it's hard because this has been the way that it's been from the ascension and will be until the last day. This isn't a new phenomenon. And there's countless ways that Satan will try to destroy the church. Countless ways that he is currently succeeding. But the one sure defense against all of that is the baby, given to us in this way. Seems too simple to be true, but it is. Okay? I'll close with that, see if there's any questions. Usually this is when the really profound questions come. Jeff?
Yeah, I know you're saying it's simple, but I think in these passages we're seeing very elaborate things going on behind the scenes
Yeah.
that we're not privy to.
Right.
In
Yep.
this play.
Exactly. Absolutely. You know, and they're so hidden from view, and or almost so simple as to be overlooked. You know, it's like they've almost become a lot of times like, you know, I'll give you, here's an example. I take the same way to work, or say the same way to church every day. Sundays, Saturdays, Mondays through Friday, doesn't matter. Today I needed to go to Wegmans. I almost got onto 390 rather than diverting from my directed path and going to, in other words, it was obvious I needed food. But I forgot it because I had gotten so used to, you know, the scenery of these particular things. And I think a lot of times we can get very used to specific scenery or traditions or whatever they happen to be. And, you know, after a little while you may be taking the same path, and you may, and this is a terrible analogy, I'm sorry. I should probably just stop now and just quit. But I'm going to keep going. I'm going to keep pushing. But then you realize that along the way, wow, you never knew that there was a field of tulips that was there. You'd never seen the elaborate nature of the building that happens to be on the north side of 390. You start to understand that, you know, and that's just what you can see from the road. You know, never mind the fact that, you know, one day you get a flat tire, which is not what you had planned, but then you have to walk and you have to see it you have to see it slower. It is so simple. But the elaborate, it's like this. It's simple, but it's not a thin veneer. It is so simple and calculated that it's such a fine point, and you realize that it goes so deep that you could dig for the rest of your life and you would never find just how deep these things are. It's not on the surface. It's not broad. It's deep. And that's the thing to remember, is that, you know, this scripture, you know, it's not just about being able to just say, well, it talks about how it is that we live it's more than just how we live our lives. It's what Christ has done in intruding into the sinful world and taking things over and buying us back from sin, death, and the devil. This book goes deep. And you're absolutely right, just in terms of the absolute depth and not necessarily the possibilities, the realities that is given to us in those few pages. So, other questions on that? All right. Go ahead, Julie.
The thing that really is interesting to me is that Dragon's standing across from a pregnant woman about to give birth, right? That's the most vulnerable a woman can ever get.
Right.
And he can't get her.
Right.
You know, I mean, I think that's a pretty interesting visual.
Yeah. Yep. And it's, you know, and understanding how he does get her.
Yeah.
You know, Eve.
Right.
And, you know, and Eve is, like I said, she's a type. But whereas Mary, you know, was different. You know, Mary was the type of and the prototypical or the perfect example, but most especially it all pointed to the perfect mother, the church. Which, you know, the same thing applies. Here the dragon stands in front of the church, and we say, we stand here. On this we can do no other. You continue to blow and bluster. Everything we've seen in Revelation to this point with regard to the confusion and all these other sorts of things, no. Here. This is where we stand. On Christ alone. You can do nothing. You know, and while all the rest of what we see around us falls and topples, the church, and this is exactly what we just read. The church, the mother, will be maintained through this. All the way through the end. I love it. And maybe, you know, it's one of those things where you wouldn't necessarily see it just looking at what Revelation 12 has to say, because it is. It's so packed.